Welcome to the debate. We are diving into, well, what's arguably one of the most common and, frankly, painful psychological paradoxes in modern dating dynamics, the kindness paradox. We hear it constantly, right? From women, from relationship experts, that men should really prioritize kindness, safety, generosity. And yet we see countless examples, countless, of men who are inherently kind, stable, generous, who nevertheless just fail to generate that initial spark, that attraction. So the core question we're debating today really revolves around the psychological priority of attraction cues. When the lights first come on, metaphorically speaking, what actually drives desire? Is it social value, those comforting, stabilizing traits like kindness? Or is the real engine sexual value? Things like emotional resonance, visible status, and that spark of projected fantasy. I'm going to contend that sexual value is the prerequisite. Attraction has to be established before social value even becomes relevant.
Okay, that's a powerful framing, I grant you that. But my concern with that perspective is that it sort of collapses two distinct things: initial marketing, let's call it, and foundational value into just one marketplace strategy. And while I completely agree that kindness alone doesn't, ignite chemistry, I come at this from a slightly different angle. I'd argue that attractiveness itself is broader. It inherently includes cues for long-term value, even if women sometimes misreport those cues or maybe just fail to recognize them consciously. The issue isn't that those long-term values are irrelevant right at the start. I think they're just masked, maybe serving as these foundational signals of capability that kind of pave the way for connection.
I see why you'd want to maybe conflate the two, but the evidence, it strongly suggests they operate on pretty different timelines. The kindness paradox exists because kindness, safety, generosity, these are the maintenance requirements women tend to impose on men they are, already interested in. The act is vetting criteria for commitment, sure, but not as drivers of that initial desire. As drivers of that initial spark, functionally, they seem pretty irrelevant. Therefore, for men seeking engagement, the highest priority really has to be generating that sexual value. And this isn't just about physical appearance, it's more about signaling competence, confidence, visible capability. This perceived status grants better leverage, better opportunities. The goal in this initial phase is actually highly non-rational. It's trying to create a kind of shared private world, a bounded, unique universe created just by the two participants, separate from external reality. And this pull, it's based heavily on projected fantasy. The woman fills in the knowledge gaps with what she hopes the man might be. So the immediate objective isn't to prove you're a good long-term provider, it's actually to avoid prematurely shattering that delicate fantasy.
Right. I agree that the initial phase is about marketing, fundamentally, and that fantasy plays this oversized role. But I think we absolutely need to distinguish clearly between what's useful to capture attention, the marketing piece, and what actually works to sustain a relationship, the substance. These seem to require two very different types of value exchange. Attractiveness fundamentals, before we even get to the complex stuff like emotional resonance, they start with the basics, signaling inherent self-care and keepability. Things like, physical fitness, meticulous hygiene, dressing well, and crucially, the ability to articulate thoughts in a compelling way. I'm just not convinced that those long-term cues are totally irrelevant at the start. Maybe they just present differently, like as short-term marketability. Value itself, which can be, bought or earned, is simply anything people move towards.
For instance, renown or even localized fame, like being the contextual alpha on a small stage, maybe the lead musician in a band or the expert giving a lecture. That works because it instantly signals status and high value. It's a really effective proxy for capability, regardless of whether that man actually has cash in his wallet or a solid long-term plan. The entire framework of attraction, I think, is fundamentally an exchange of value.
Okay, let's delve into the mechanics of that exchange then, specifically focusing on how that initial connection is actually forged. You touched on the ability to talk. My position here is that the most vulnerable organ of seduction is probably the woman's mind. Her brain is in effect the primary erogenous zone, and engaging that requires mastering a specific kind of communication. Masculine communication, typically, is very semantic, relaying facts, conveying information, checking for comprehension, you know? Feminine communication, which is essential for creating that shared private world we talked about, it's much more about emotional resonance. Think of it like tuning forks. Successful communication means you provoke a comparable or analogous emotional experience in the other person. So if she tells you she had a terrible, stressful day, the man who responds with pure semantic logic immediately tries to fix the problem, right? Gives her 5 rational solutions.
A resonance means recognizing the feeling, that feeling of being frustrated, and reflecting that back somehow to deepen the emotional connection. The failure here is often this functional fixation on semantic content, trying to inject pure logic into an interaction that's really fueled by emotion.
And that fixation on literal semantic content, that sort of, robotic response is absolutely the Achilles heel of intersexual understanding. I totally grant that. The goal in those exchanges is often, like you said, to provoke an emotional state so the man can understand not just intellectually, but experientially what she's actually feeling. However, and this is key, while charismatic emotional resonance is crucial for chemistry, it must eventually be backed up by recognized sustained value. We can't just be performers, focus only on, the enchanting effect. If a man only masters the emotional choreography but lacks behavioral consistency in the long run, the relationship is built on a facade, isn't it? And speaking of consistency and value, I still maintain that visible renown or localized status is perhaps the single most potent tool for initial attraction because it acts as such a powerful, immediate proxy for status, far more effective, I think, than hidden wealth or quiet power.
Why do you prioritize that external visible status so highly, though?
Because it's verifiable social proof. It's not like money in a bank account, which, let's be honest, can be faked or exaggerated. Status is judged by the crowd, and we see data suggesting a highly regulated sexual marketplace where women, particularly when empowered to choose freely, overwhelmingly target the perceived top tier of men. That contextual alpha status, that guy who can just command the attention of a room, it's a shortcut to proving value. He sort of bypasses the need to explain or prove his capabilities because the environment itself already validates them. It's pure leverage in the dating marketplace.
Okay, I understand the marketability of that instant status. I do. But my concern is the quality of the attraction it generates. That kind of high status attraction often leads only to, pretty shallow relationships, doesn't it? The women attracted exclusively by the contextual alpha status often seem to have, frankly, no interest in having a long-term commitment if his underlying life lacks basic substance. I mean, if the high-status musician is broke, living month to month, has zero capacity for stability, the spark might be profound, sure, but the connection is probably fleeting. So you might be optimizing for sexual opportunity, yes, but achieving a relationally barren outcome. The values required to keep a woman, things like stability, security, future planning, seem diametrically opposed often to those that initially attract her, like spontaneity, risk, novelty.
And that divergence, that's exactly what makes the transition point so incredibly unstable. The man who relies purely on performance and fantasy will inevitably face what you've termed the crisis of disappointment.
Precisely. Men consistently blow the first date, or at least the early phase of courtship, by talking too much. Often, it's out of this misguided desire to prove their social value. They try to preemptively list their stability credentials, I have a good job, I own a house. This just shatters the woman's carefully constructed projected fantasy way too early. Since the likelihood that anything he says factually matches her private ideal is basically zero, he has to tread really carefully. The transition requires, ideally, a slow and gradual disappointment, a gentle move from the fantasy to reality without sudden shock. If you rush to reveal all your flaws and virtues right away, you disabuse her of the hope she brought to the interaction.
But the crisis of disappointment is inevitable, though, wouldn't you say? I would argue the relationship doesn't truly begin in earnest until that fantasy shatters anyway, whether it's through one significant betrayal or maybe just an accumulation of small, consistent inconsistencies. Until that moment happens, the relationship is kind of distorted by pure attraction. It's essentially, a performance. And this leads us straight to the fundamental paradox that makes long-term partnerships so damn difficult. The challenge of maintaining both stability and safety, which necessarily leads to comfort and predictability, alongside passionate lover status, which requires spontaneity, risk, novelty. The very traits that successfully attract, that excitement, the risk-taking, the charisma, often become the very things disliked later in life. Criticized as unpredictability or instability. It's a hyper-conflated set of needs we're now asking one single person to carry.
It is the paradox of the modern love marriage. Absolutely. We're expecting a partner to be both an emotionally stable, predictable companion and a passionate, spontaneous lover. And this reality just confirms my initial premise. The attraction phase and the commitment phase draw upon fundamentally paradoxical values. You have to actively, creatively manage that oscillation between predictability and novelty. That's why, changing context, traveling together, adopting new shared projects, these things can sometimes spark sexual interest again because they reintroduce novelty into an otherwise predictable framework. But that initial spark, that sexual value, it's the precondition that allows for the risk and the investment in the first place.
And that is where we find our deepest, perhaps most necessary tension. I see them as two distinct but equally necessary values that need to be exchanged over time. Excitement and sexual availability are exchanged initially, maybe for attention and opportunity, allowing for that emotional resonance you described so well. Then security and maybe child-rearing capacity are exchanged later for commitment. If the man's initial marketability, his attraction factor, doesn't align with his actual substance, his security and consistency, when that fantasy inevitably breaks, well, the relationship structure is likely to collapse.
So to summarize my position, initial attraction is primarily driven by non-rational, emotional, and status cues that generate the necessary fantasy and chemistry. Kindness and security aren't the engine of attraction. They are, however, the necessary foundation for the subsequent commitment phase. Men need to focus first on generating that sexual value through things like fitness, visible capability, and mastering emotional resonance in communication, just to gain entry into the woman's attention span, really.
And my summary is that the needs are inherently paradoxical. Attraction and keeping are essentially two separate problems, requiring the exchange of those differing values across the lifespan of the relationship. The huge difficulty today is that we now expect one partner to meet this highly complex, hyper-conflated set of needs that, in previous eras might have been distributed across an entire community or extended family. The complexity really lies in managing this oscillation across a lifetime. Too much initial attraction can be distortive, build in too high a fantasy. Too little attraction, well, it often can't overcome basic behavioral inertia.
Indeed. Finding that balance, navigating that zone between necessary fantasy and inevitable reality, that seems to be the central challenge of relationships today, that attempt to reconcile stability with enduring passion. The material certainly suggests there's always more to explore in how we balance these opposing yet necessary forces across a lifetime. Thank you for this illuminating exchange.